Welcome to the Lightbulb Moment podcast. You are listening to episode 14, How to Approach Engagement in Your Webinars. I'm your host, Mike, and I'm joined by virtual classroom expert, Joe. In this episode, the challenges of engagement, how and why it's important in a webinar, I challenge the need for it at all, and our key takeaway, engagement tips for your next webinar. Joe, you mentioned before the differences between virtual classroom and webinars, that virtual classroom normally has about 12 max attendees, generally lasts longer so people can get their teeth really stuck into a topic. Lots of open discussion and engagement for learning opportunities. Does that sound about right?
Yep, totally agree with that. It maybe 10 people max, but yeah, basically you're right.
Okay, well, this is where we agree to disagree, or don't agree to disagree, might be more the point. But it's the last point I want to go into detail with today, and that is engagement. Many people understand there is a need for it in the virtual classroom, and we'll go into detail about this probably in its own multi-part series in the future, because it's such an important thing. But today I want to focus on webinars. Take us through the basics of engagement in a webinar.
Yeah, really, really good points. So in virtual classrooms, our engagement point, it could just be a couple of seconds of, green tick if you agree with this, or it could be 5 or 10 minutes or a longer activity. It could be a half an hour breakout activity using software, role play, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
The challenge we have in a webinar is that actually you've often got a shorter amount of time, could be half an hour or an hour, and your attendees or audience, well, let's face it, they're probably not giving you 100% of their attention. And therefore, they sometimes lack the ability to really easily engage with you.
That sounds like some major challenges. I guess the major challenge is going to be email, as you said.
Yeah.
But I mean, so how do we get past these challenges? I mean, what do you think?
Well, of course, you're right. They're challenges, but with every challenge, of course, comes opportunity. So if people aren't giving you 100% of their attention, quite frankly, you probably aren't engaging them early enough and often enough. And that could actually it can really impact your webinar, because if they aren't engaging with you, well, they're not going to do basically what you want, whether that's behaviour change or sales or whatever it might be.
Great point. So what do many webinars do wrong currently then?
Oh, so much. Did you say that this was a multi-part series?
Potentially.
Okay, well, we've all been on those webinars that are a bit rubbish. And I know you guys listening out there are nodding and smiling and going, oh, there was that one where somebody lectured, or there was that one where somebody there was no interaction, or maybe there was no chat box. And if you've looked at my blog, you know I love a good chat box. Maybe you're thinking, oh, that one with the boring slides, and I just switched off. And often people put this maybe on a second screen or split screen. They're checking their emails, or maybe they're not actually looking at the screen at all and they're just listening. So that's what we're doing wrong. All sorts of things around slide design, voice, presentation, interaction, use of the technology.
Okay, I completely agree. And I've been on those webinars as well. I can testify.
Are you talking about my webinars now, Mike?
No, definitely not our webinars, Joe.
Yes, sorry.
But apart from the obvious reasons of people switching off, what are the main problems here? Lots of webinars are free, providing information about a product or a service. They often seem like basically really long TV adverts. The host provides information and you listen. That's how it works? No?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have your marketing webinars, you have your sales webinars, you have your product information, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We're not saying don't do a marketing webinar or a sales webinar. That's not the point. What we're saying is do them really well. Make them the best version of an interactive marketing webinar that you can. So webinars really started off quite basic. Obviously, the technology was quite basic years ago, and they were just talking pieces. But think about how our audiences have evolved now. How many people watch TV and are looking through Twitter whilst watching the Great British Bake Off or something like that and getting involved in the conversation? And obviously we see good and bad webinars. And what we're seeing with a lot of companies when they're doing it really well is high returns on good webinars. So if you're...
And that's really where the whole point of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, whether that's engagement, so with Training Journal, for instance, we're all about engaging the community, or it could be in numbers of people for leads. So on 24.com, they've got their own platform and they do loads of research about marketing webinars. And they've got some great stats about when you should do a webinar, how you should run it, how long it should be, in terms of getting that value from it. And then what we're looking at really is production values and the planning behind that. And I could go off on one on that, and I know you'll pull me back from it, Mike. But it's making it more important to keep to that high standard, to innovate where we can, because our audiences don't want to be bored. Our audiences want to be engaged.
I guess it's one of these things that, before we had channel 1 through 4, and that was it. Whereas now all of a sudden you've got so many channels, so many different webinars, and people are starting to see better things. So the standard, you've got to bring it up. You can't just do a 60-minute webinar lecture if you want the information to come across.
Well, if you do, you have to make it the best 60-minute lecture webinar there is.
Okay. So you've convinced me that webinars are important. They need to reflect a professional and good image for your organisation. Now, is engagement really the way to achieve this, to keep people from leaving early or not really listening? Does it have to be engagement, or is that a huge factor that needs to be considered?
Well, of course, I'm going to say yes. That's kind of the point of our podcast, isn't it? It's a little bit of a loaded question. But no, there are good reasons behind it. It's not just I'm saying that because that's how I like to learn.
Okay, well, let's look at some of the basic engagement points to try in a webinar, how to use them and should you use them, so that our listeners can get an idea of the differences then.
Of course. So all sorts of different things. And you have to obviously do what is right for your audience, for your need. So we had a client recently who said, we want to start doing webinars. We want brand awareness and people to engage with our organisation. But we don't think they're going to be too difficult because we're not going to have much conversation going on. And I said, well, okay, if you want to do that, that's a video, because then people will engage with you by listening and seeing that you're great and everything that you're saying, and that's awesome. But the whole point of a webinar for me is engaging with your audience, because then you get to know your audience and they can ask you questions and get to know you. And the easiest way to do that is with a chat panel where people type questions or comments and you say, great, Bob, that's exactly what we're talking about. Or thank you, Alice, that's a great challenge that you've got. And here's a suggestion.
And I guess this goes back to the point of what I was saying earlier of these webinars. Sometimes people view them as just really long TV adverts.
Yeah, or radio kind of podcasts or something like that.
Exactly. But what makes a webinar different is the fact that you can then sit there and whilst this TV advert is going on, you can actually say, hold on, person on the TV advert, why does it work that way? Or I've got a question about this, and you can actually respond. That's where you get the engagement from it and answers to the questions.
Yeah, and people feel really included. And even when you're listening to a recorded webinar, which I do a lot, because I do a lot of work where I'm, just head down in email or whatever, and I often have a webinar playing on a second screen. And the difference between a lecture webinar or what would normally be just a presentation, and one where it's really interactive with polls, for instance, to find out what the audience is like and therefore tailor your message, and even just answering questions and making comments and just going, oh, Bob, that's really funny, you've had such and such experience, whatever. Actually, it makes it more vital, it makes it more real, it more alive, and that's really key, whether you're actually attending live or on the recording.
And that's a lot of information, and there are some great examples of really good engagement there. And I like what you're saying about polls or whiteboards to engage the audience and tailor the message. I guess if it's just a recorded video, that message is always going to be the same, whereas this way you can sort of be in touch with who you've got in the sort of on the webinar and tailor that message to it. So I would like to know, in a nutshell,
A nutshell? Do you know the size of my nutshells, Michael?
I know. What is the core learning principle, if there is one, behind the reasoning of doing this in a webinar?
Well, I can't do that in a nutshell. I will pick out one thing that is nutshell sized for you. Russ Edgerton introduced the term pedagogies of engagement in an education white paper in 2001. And in it, he stated that learning about things does not enable students to acquire the abilities and understanding they will need for the 21st century. And that's what I'm referring to. I know about stuff, but that's not the same as really diving in deep, getting our hands dirty and being able to do things. So if we do something as simple as problem solving in their learning, rather than just learning about something, then people have a tangible thing to go away and apply to their work.
Wow, that is really interesting. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we probably need to do a multi-part series on engagement in the virtual classroom and in webinars, whilst relating to all of best practice, modern learning methodology and pedagogy. But I'm with you. I'm following with what you're saying here. And I think
I sense a but.
Well, I think I'm understanding your reasoning behind it in a webinar, but I want to take a different point of view for a second, and one that actually we hear often from people that we're training, whether it's to do with webinars or virtual classrooms. So a lot of issue that people have is the fact that they have a long script of information, and they need to get through it. The webinar is timed to that script, and they just don't have time to stop for all of the engagement. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, and you're right. It is something that people say to us quite often. And they say, well, this is all really great, Joe, but if I put in all these activities, what do I do with my 2 hours of content? Because suddenly you've given me an hour of activity and I don't have a 3-hour session for a virtual classroom or similar for a webinar. So if you've planned it out in fine detail, it can feel like a real challenge, because basically what I'm probably telling you is cut some of your content so that you can put in your engagement.
Okay, but then we then hear the response of, but I can't cut the content. I need all of the content, the entire information in my webinar the attendee needs to know. Cutting the content, they won't get the full picture. They're not going to buy my product if they don't fully understand it.
Yeah, or it could be in compliance training that they need to know every detail of this law, or I need to make sure that they've seen every phrase, or whatever it might be. And or like you say with product training, it could be they need to know every single piece of the product. But the thing is, if your attendee is at the worst case scenario logging out of your webinar after 5, 10 or 15 minutes, they're not going to get any of the picture or any of your content. And actually, I was listening to a webinar yesterday doing some work, and it was 15 minutes before they even got to the proper content.
Wow.
So luckily I just had it on in the background and didn't mind. But if I was attending that live, I might have been a bit like, come on guys, where is it? But also, even if people do stay, but they're not engaging, they're in their email, we all know, and we know this despite what we think, we can't multitask. So if somebody is talking and you're reading your email, technically, physically, your brain cannot process both of those things in the language part of your brain. So the moment at which you're reading your email properly, you're engaged on that, and you've missed something that's said. And that then is the problem. So actually, they're going to miss something anyway. Regardless of what you've broadcast, they're not receiving that message.
Yeah, and I guess this... But the thing is, I guess you haven't really answered the question.
All right. So...
well, because the problem is... cutting content. I'm doing a marketing webinar, and the point of that is that they're going to buy a service or a product. And I sit there and I've put that into 3 different sections, this, and once they know all 3 of those, they're definitely going to buy my thing. You're now cutting some of that time. How can I do this?
So, yeah, I'm going to cut some of that content, quite frankly. It could be your stories. It could be the detail of the content. I don't know. But it's about directing them to more: a brochure, a web page, a blog, a podcast, and that way.
So are these resources afterwards, or are these being given in the webinar?
Either or both. It could be you have a brochure that people can download immediately inside the session and be looking at there and then, or they click on a link to a web page and they can look at it there and then.
But playing devil's advocate again. Nobody clicks the links in the webinar. Maybe I've been running webinars. I've done 20 webinars, and I've stopped putting links in because people don't click on them?
That's because, quite frankly, Mike, you are rubbish at engagement. That's the problem you're having. But no, the trouble is, if you haven't...
that doesn't really help our listeners who are having this issue. If you'd like to go into maybe a little bit more detail on that.
If you haven't engaged people right from the beginning, if they haven't felt valued, if they haven't felt heard, and if you haven't made them interested in what you're doing, then they're not going to click on it. If I've second screened it or I'm listening and I can't see the chat window on my screen, I'm probably going to miss the link. Or even if you say, here's the link to the brochure, I'm probably not so interested and engaged because I'm doing something else. However, if you have engaged me from the very beginning, asked me questions, reacted to things, maybe read out some of my comments, used questions and polling in order to direct the conversation a little bit more, I'm in that window. I may be in the chat window typing and you share a link and all of a sudden like, oh, what's that? I'll click on it. You've got somebody who's engaged and is valuing what you're doing and actually is much more likely to take that direction or that nudge, if you like, and they'll be engaged in what you're doing. And yeah, you do have to cut out the content to do that. But if you've engaged me and made me interested, I want to see that content even more. And that's a much, much better prospect.
Okay. You've started to convince me on this.
I was getting a bit passionate and hot under the collar there, Mike.
Well, I've still got some difficult, challenging questions here with this devil's advocate bit that we're doing here. And this is the thing. Okay, so fine. You've convinced me that I should do that or my staff should do that. But what if my staff can't focus on the delivery and all of the engagement you want them to do? What if it has to be one or the other?
So are you saying that the staff delivering the webinar are not skilled enough to engage with the chat window, for instance?
Yeah, let's say that. Let's say I've got people, they deliver a webinar once a month or whatever it is, and they're coming to me and saying, well, Mike, you want to do all of this engagement. That means I'm going to be in the chat window. I'm going to be trying to go through my facilitator guide. It's just not going to work. What's your answer to that? What's your response?
Or hire me to do it for you, or hire me to train you how to do it. That's my basic answer.
So basically what you're saying is your staff need to have the freedom, some training to develop and maybe just to try and test those things out.
I suppose you could put it that way, yes. No, it's all about developing that skill. So if you've got somebody doing that once or twice a year, once a month, if that, and they don't have those skills, then yeah, they can tweak those skills a little bit. But maybe it's about saying, okay, Bob's the subject matter expert. We want them to present something. We know for whatever reason it's not the best thing for that person to develop those skills. Well, then you need a webinar host or producer. So that's the person who could keep an eye on a busy chat window. And especially when you get into getting to 30 or 50 or 100 or more people, it can get really quite busy. And they can pick out the questions and say, hey, Bob, we've got this great question. Tell us a bit more. And it could be a lot more like a conversation, which in itself is more engaging.
Okay. My last attack. Here.
Another one. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Mike.
Well, you're defending the blows pretty well. I think you're doing well.
You're wearing me down. Go on.
Okay, so then the last point that we hear often people say, I've been on loads of webinars where the attendees just don't get involved. Even if there is engagement, I'm sure we try to get engagement and then nothing happens.
That's so horrible. It's that tumbleweed moment, isn't it? And he's like, is it still working? Like tap, tap, tap. Hello, can you hear me? So 9 times out of 10, this is not technology. So this is where like having a second laptop, you can see you're still connected, nothing's crashed. So barring, literally your computer's crashed and it's not working. Let's assume it's not that. I think it could be something simple like you've asked the wrong question or you haven't got a very clear question. It could be that you haven't asked properly. You haven't told people type in the chat or whatever it might be. So that's all stuff that we focus on a lot, is structuring your engagement and wording it really well. But actually, it can happen. I'm not going to lie to you. I've had it happen to me more times than I can count. But what we're looking at here is, have you engaged right from the beginning? Have you designed it in? Have you designed it well? Are you doing it well? And by that, I mean not just saying, question blah, 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 put it in the chat window, and then being silent and going, okay, and moving on, that would be terrible. Whereas what I do is a version of put it in the chat window. Bob, you said this. Alice, you said this. Oh, Mike, that's a bit challenging. I'm not sure about it. And you kind of react to what's going on there. But if we're looking specifically at a webinar that's a bit more marketing or sales oriented, especially if it's more kind of public and open, what you've got to look at even before you go live or anything is what has a positive or a negative impact on your engagement is, have you promoted your webinar properly? Have you had the sign-ups that you need? Have you got the right audience? Have you written the copy right? Is the heading right? And I find that really a challenging area. And that goes into a bit more about marketing, but that's part of it as well.
That sounds like we've just worked out another podcast in the future.
We've got a very long list, Mike.
Okay, so breathe, smile. I really enjoyed challenging you on that. And I wonder, maybe we should just do this as like a regular part of the podcast.
But the trouble is, Mike, this is just our normal everyday conversation. If anybody could hear our Skype conversations when we're working, and Mike just has this face where I look at it and I go, I know you're saying tell me more, but I can see that you're thinking she's talking rubbish.
Yeah, it only happens 10, 20 times a day. It's not a big deal. Okay, so I really enjoyed that. So coming back to our key learning point, engagement in webinars, can you give us some highlights? I'm not going to say in a nutshell. Give us the highlights. Whatever you feel that the highlights should be, you go for it, Jo.
Okay, so highlights. Webinars are evolving. The expectations of our attendees is increasing, and we don't want them to log off or switch off or just ignore us. Basic engagement, interacting with the chat panel, voicing what people have said and making them feel heard is important. It doesn't need to massively slow down or impact your webinar, but it makes a huge difference. A big list or a script of information that you need to provide. It is important. You've probably seen my facilitator guide template on our blog, and that's great. But you need your different points of engagement, get people involved, interested and committed, and that will actually increase the results of what you're trying to achieve rather than just dumping more information on people.
Definitely agree with that.
For classrooms, whether it's online or face-to-face, interactions with friends and family that you've not heard of, whoever it might be, if they don't have a chance to voice their thoughts or opinions, they switch off and they disengage. Exactly the same in webinars. And finally, it might not be easy to start, but if you're willing to give it a try, adapt your end goals or results from the webinar, you're going to see much greater success and increase your success in your webinars. And then come and tell us about it. We'd love to know what your challenges and your successes were.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of those. And I think maybe sometimes part of it is just changing what the success of your webinar actually is.
Not even that. It's changing the way you get to a result.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like sometimes people might do a marketing webinar and be like, right, the success here is 10 signups or 20 products sold or whatever. But actually, sometimes it's just changing the mindset of how much engagement did we get? Are people coming back on another webinar?
I think we've got another podcast kind of topic there, Mike. We'll come back to that one.
For sure. But no, I think that was a great summary. That was really good, Jo. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So, Mike, we of course have our free open virtual classroom and webinar community at lightbulbmoment.community. Are there any posts that you've liked on there recently?
Well, definitely. And for sure, I would say with this webinar discussion, definitely go on to lightbulbmoment.community. If you've got these questions about getting engagement or things like that, post them in the community because exactly like what I'm just about to go over now, people are finding value and getting answers to their questions. So two posts really struck me. And I love the question from Paul Norrington. He asked, in quotations, does learning to deliver virtually make you a better trainer or facilitator in the face-to-face environment too? And actually, I can't say quote because I read that differently than what the actual quote was. But But Kevin May agreed with him and transferring elements from each methodology, as you commented about their positive feedback you've got from people.
Yeah, loads of positive comments about how people in their face-to-face training has improved because they've learnt from us about what to do online.
So always really great responses on the community, really worth checking out. On our next podcast, we're doing another guest series one, and Joe is going to be talking to Jeff, and I don't even want to try and pronounce the last name, Joe. I don't want sort of hate mail from Jeff here.
It's Jeff Kortenbosch.
Okay, brilliant. I look forward to listening to that guest series podcast next time.
Thanks very much. Bye. Thank you for listening. We really hope you enjoyed it and look forward to your feedback and your comments. If you like the podcast, please remember to subscribe and to share. You can follow Mike on Twitter @MikeLightBulb. You can follow me on Twitter @LightBulbJoe, and for other updates @MomentLightBulb. You can also find our podcasts on YouTube along with more great content. If you're in need of virtual classroom training, check out lightbulbmoment.online. For our blogs, lightbulbmoment.info. And remember our free community for questions and resources, lightbulbmoment.community.